Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this RSA webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Meredith Doig. I'm president of the Rationalist Society, which is Australia's oldest free thought group. And wherever you're joining us from, the RSA acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land and sea and community. So tonight, we're discussing the problem of truth, or rather the lack of truth, in political advertising. Now, my own view is that ever since the American Tea Party more or less invented the tactic of just say no to everything, political advertising and other things, but political advertising has become more and more outrageous and less truthful. And while in the commercial world, consumers have the ACCC and organisations like Choice magazine to hold commercial operators to account, in politics, you've got players like Clive Palmer or Craig Kelly, and they can get away with just telling outright lies, seemingly with no consequences at all. So this is an issue that has really engaged the RSA recently. We've added to our stable of concerns. We've got a new policy on our website which acknowledges that while there should be a robust contest of ideas, lies and deception have no place in Australian political discourse. Deceptive and misleading advertising should be prohibited in the same way that deceptive and misleading advertising is prohibited in the commercial arena. And we say that all Australian jurisdictions, both state and federal, should enact truth in political advertising laws. But I have to say that other organisations have been there before the RSA, and in particular, the Australia Institute has done a lot of work on this issue over a number of years and has been a leading advocate for truth in political advertising. And our guest tonight has been a large part of that effort. Bill Browne is a senior researcher with the Australia Institute's Democracy and Accountability Program. And apart from the issue of truth in political advertising, Bill's got a wide range of interests and policy areas that include the use of opinion polling, carbon capture and storage, digital technology, proportionate fines. Interested to know what that actually means, Bill, and the role of the states and the Senate in Australian democracy. And prior to coming to the Australia Institute, and he's been with them for a number of years, he worked as an ESG analyst, and ESG stands for Environmental, Social and Governance. So, Bill will present for about 20 minutes and we might have a bit of interaction before or during that presentation. And then as usual, we'll work through questions that have been sent in beforehand. We do have some questions like that. Or there's always the chat box. So if there are questions that occur to you while Bill's giving his presentation, please feel free to jot them into the chat box and we'll go through those. Or we might just let you ask your own questions during the Q&A. As always, I try to keep these sessions to an hour. So we'll try to finish up within the hour because I know that it's late in the evening. So just to make sure that I treasure your time with us, we'll keep it to the 1 hour. So with that short introduction, Bill, can I hand it over to you to give your presentation, please?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Meredith, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We've been talking about truth in political advertising since roughly the 2019 election. So it's been an issue we've been following for some time. And unfortunately, it's only seemed like it's gotten worse over that period. Before I was on the case, my colleagues at the Australia Institute had their interest peaked in 2016, when you had the famous Mediscare complaints about misleading advertising. And there was actually a bit of a feeling then that there might be movement on this issue, but those reform hopes didn't go ahead at that time. Hopefully we're in a better moment now. And in fact, as I go through the presentation, I think you'll see that there are reasons to be hopeful that we're in a better position to address this problem, even as it seems to get worse and more pressing. So part of the problem, I think, with misinformation is that it's often a tit for tat problem. So it might be deployed more effectively by one side or the other, even employed more often by one side or the other. But when it's used successfully, it tends to prompt the other side to pursue similar tactics, often feeling vindicated in doing so because they've suffered in turn from the people that they're up against. So I mentioned Mediscare as kind of kicking off interest in 2016, but in 2019, we saw death taxes as another alleged scare campaign. This election, there's been claims that they talk about cashless debit cards for pensioners, or the idea that voting for so-and-so gives you another party that you might like less due to preferences, has also been described as misleading advertising. So it's a situation that risks becoming a free-for-all, a death spiral where it gets worse and worse over time. And unfortunately, it can be within the business model of social media platforms to heighten the distribution of misinformation, as well as more generally conflict, because engagement drives revenue in their services. So it's a problem that is not new. It must have existed for as long as politics has existed, but there are certain features of our current system that make it potentially more prevalent or virulent than it used to be.
Bill, can I just interrupt there, because you say that it must have existed all the time, but I've been around probably for longer than you have, and it seems to me that, as I said in my introduction, when the Tea Party in America came on the scene, that they had a tactic of just saying no to everything that the other side said, and that seemed to filter across to Australia. I mean, I get that there's always been, lies and damn statistics, something like that. Anyway, there's always been lies, but it seems to have been exacerbated since the Tea Party. Is that something that you've observed, or you have a different view?
Yeah, I don't have a good sense of kind of what the causal elements might be, particularly if there has been a resurgence. You certainly see, particularly in the United States, growing polarization, dating, maybe not exactly to the Tea Party, but as part of the same trend. And so I wonder if part of the reason you see that is because the incentives for parties might have changed, with less of a middle to appeal to. There might be more rewards by going to your base, even if you risk putting off people who are kind of torn between both sides. But yeah, I'm not sure. It's not something we've delved into, so I can't give you anything more definitive than that, I'm afraid.
Okay, sorry to interrupt. Please.
No, it's a good question. What we have observed over time is a democratic deficit in general. And so some of the long-running surveys that you see, including some that go back to the 70s or the 60s, can kind of give us a sense of how trust in government has survived or not survived over the years. And by some of those measures, we're at a lower point of trust than we ever have been before. in terms of, I'll just check the wording here, but the idea that people in government can be trusted. And when you measure things like confidence that either democracy or politics can get things done, you might not be looking at a record low, but you're looking at something pretty close to the lows that we've seen before. So this, I think it's connected in that this growing problem with misleading advertising, general disengagement with politics, all kind of accumulates into a real sense that democracy needs to be revitalized in Australia as also around the world. There's some concern about emerging technologies. So if you've heard of deep fakes, the idea that you can transpose a photograph of a person onto a recording of another, use artificial intelligence to kind of smooth out the differences and make quite a convincing video of someone talking. I think it's understandable to be concerned about that. And you can imagine it along with the mass generation of fake news, for example, written again by AI, as being a potential problem in the future. But the reality is that you can create a scare campaign with something as simple as slowing down audio so it seems like someone's slurring their words, or chopping up a interaction so that someone says something they didn't say. You don't need to get very sophisticated to create misleading content. So when we look at this kind of problem of political advertising, I guess you need to ask firstly, what is political advertising? And secondly, what might make it truthful or untruthful? The laws in practice, and I'll get to some details about the law, but to kind of put it in context first, are generally limited to electoral matter. So that's content that's been published, kind of fixed in form. It might be a radio ad, a TV ad, a brochure, a social media post, but it doesn't cover a speech that's been delivered or off-the-cuff comments in an interview. That's kind of separate from the published material that we're talking about here with advertising. But it is worth noting that it doesn't have to be paid advertising. So that's why the Facebook post or the flyer can count. Perhaps more thorny than that then is the question of what's truth, what's true. And while philosophers might have pondered this question, in reality, I think it's fairly straightforward. We have courts that exist as fact-finding institutions. And as Meredith said at the start, we require the content that's used in trade and commerce to be not misleading and not inaccurate. So these are problems that the courts have had to deal with in practice throughout the years. And there's no particular reason why they couldn't do that for electoral matter as well. However, it does raise some concerns when you think about the cut of and thrust of an election campaign. Is a promise something that can be true or untrue, given it's only fulfilled in the future? What about the claim that someone won't do as they've promised to do, which we know politicians sometimes don't do what they've promised? So can you say that they're not going to? Similarly, what about a lie by omission? If we were in trade and commerce and you knew that I had the wrong idea about the product you were selling, that might well be unlawful. But it's hard to imagine politics done where you had to correct every misinterpretation that your voters had of you. So it does get a bit thornier in that regard. And we'll talk a bit about how the courts have adjudicated cases like this. I think finally I have to acknowledge, because it came up in a radio interview I did the other week, the idea of kind of truthiness, or something that, even if it's not true, feels like it's basically true. And I think this goes to the heart of why a lot of misleading advertising works and why it ends up being defended by its supporters. You might say something about your opponent that's untrue, but it feels like it speaks to something, a deeper truth that is real. So maybe they're not planning to do something, but you feel like they want to do something. They'd do it if they could, even if they haven't announced that they're actually going to do it. So this real sense that because there's such animosity and distrust in politics, an untrue statement can still satisfy a deep kind of feeling inside. And I think it's worth recognizing that emotional reaction that we have to understand why this advertising is so successful. So I mentioned we have.
Sorry, I was just going to say, so you're raising the issue of how do you define the truth? How do you put a boundary around what is true and what is not true if you're going to have a law about it? But they do it in the commercial area. So is it that difficult? Is it that different?
I think you do need to tread more carefully in the political arena, where you want views to be ventilated, and you need to leave space for contrarians and free thinkers and people who represent a minority opinion. It's a little different to something like trade and commerce, where you're kind of in a marketplace. You're expected to treat with everyone who comes to you. You do need to make very sure that you're not intruding on the right to voice an opinion, even if that opinion is kind of itself based on misconceptions about the world. It is entitled to be protected. So it is a little more fraught, but I think you're right that in general, courts should be able to arbitrate, and independent bodies should be able to arbitrate without too much grief on most of these questions.
Right. But there is a difference between, is there not, between facts and opinions?
There is. And it's something, it's something that comes up in the existing truth in political advertising laws that we have in South Australia and more recently the ACT. So in South Australia, the laws are at great pains to emphasise that they regulate statements purporting to be statements of fact.
Right.
And what's more, what's misleading and inaccurate has to be to a material extent.
Right.
So it's not enough that you make a simple error about what year something happened in or so on. It has to actually go to the heart.
Right. And it has to be intentional?
It doesn't have to be intentional, no.
Okay.
However, in practice, the penalties are fairly light. And so an innocent mistake would carry few consequences, I think, beyond the reasonable expectation that you correct the innocent mistake. So South Australia's laws, they cover electoral advertisements, they're statements purporting to be statements of fact, inaccurate and misleading. But the step that happens if you come across material that you think's misleading in South Australia in one of their state elections, you report it to the Electoral Commissioner. They'll do their due diligence. And if they conclude that the law has been broken, their first step is to order it to be withdrawn or retracted. So either take it out of circulation or correct the record publicly, or both.
And how long does that take?
It's a good question, and it goes to the rub of the effectiveness of the laws. Because you can imagine in the heat of an election campaign, a decision that comes too late is almost as bad as no decision at all. In practice, the Electoral Commission keeps itself to a pretty tight deadline. I think they aim for a couple of days turnaround, but they're dependent on getting information about the ad from the complainant. And if you're listening to the radio or you see something on TV, it can be very hard for you to get the relevant information to the commission. Or you might have the information but not report it in a way that's particularly useful, like it doesn't go to the details of what's misleading. So that's often where the delay happens, on the complainant side rather than the commission side. There are penalties that come into play at any time that matter, even if the election's passed. The fines that exist are fairly small and rarely levelled, but an entire election in one of the electorates can be redone if there's misleading advertising, and that misleading advertising could have, their test is on the balance of probabilities affected the result in that electorate. So then you'd actually have to redo the election in that seat. And that's a hefty penalty indeed. It's never occurred. The misleading advertising has never been effective enough to have changed the course of a seat, how it went.
But this is just in South Australia at the moment, is that right?
That's right. South Australia and the ACT adopted a very similar model, but they haven't gone to an election with it yet.
Right. And do you know whether in South Australia there has been a complaint that has led to an election in a particular electorate being redone?
Yeah, never. In the about 30-year term that the laws have been in place, it's been considered by courts fairly often. And it's where we get a lot of our case law about how the law applies to the withdrawal and retraction of advertisements, because that's the kind of thing that's probably not worth taking to a court. But the entire course of an election in a seat does get litigated fairly often. And yeah, there have been times when the courts upheld that it's misleading advertising, but if there's a 1,000 vote buffer between the winner and the second place candidate, you'd have to have a pretty extensive and pretty convincing advertising campaign to change the course of the election. So it might well come up in the future, but it hasn't led to a result being overturned.
So it's only really if the result is on a knife edge.
That's right.
It might, that the courts might say, well, this is material enough to be able to say the other side might have won had it not been for this misleading or deceptive conduct.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
So as well as being adopted in the ACT, the South Australian model has had a lot of momentum in recent years more broadly. So the independent MP Zali Steggall, after her election in 2019, actually cooperated with a Liberal MP, Jason Falinski, to make the call for truth in political advertising laws at the federal level. And Zali Steggall has since drafted a bill, the Stop the Lies bill, which would implement a kind of South Australian model at the federal level. It learns some of the lessons.
How did she go?
It's there to be debated. It hasn't been debated or voted upon at this point. There's some noises that there might be more success in the next parliament. It remains a priority for independents on the crossbench, as well as many who are running as candidates. As I said, Jason Falinski, one of the members of the Liberal Party, joined the call initially, and the Labor Party has recently added it to its party platform. So there's promising moves there at the federal level. We've also seen successes at the Victorian level with their Electoral Matters Committee recommending truth in political advertising laws. And that recommendation, which was a multi-party recommendation, has been adopted by both the government and the opposition. So we might see these laws in Victoria soon as well. And I think you can draw a parallel there to the voluntary assisted dying laws, where the adoption of these laws in one state makes it much easier for them to get picked up by others as well, once the momentum starts growing.
Except New South Wales.
That's right, yeah.
For voluntary assisted dying anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think that South Australia passed these laws in 1985, it's a slow burn, but it does feel like things are picking up more recently.
But also, isn't it sort of part of the same public concern with integrity? And there's a big push for the ICAC, for a federal ICAC that has sufficient teeth to really make a difference. Could this not be part of that general concern or that movement to have an institution that oversees integrity?
I think the two dovetail quite nicely, and the Australian Institute actually has some polling out today which finds that about half of Australians say they're as concerned with integrity issues this election as they were last election, and 30% say they're more concerned about integrity issues this election than last, which I think is a pretty powerful figure that gives you a bit of a sense that these issues are growing in importance, and they do seem to come together as democratic reforms, accountability reforms that would fix some of the problems that we're having with our politics. So I think you're right that they're complementary. I think you wouldn't necessarily make an integrity commission responsible for enforcing truth in political advertising laws, but they come from a similar place.
The motivation is similar.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think the South Australian model has kind of proven itself as a workable, it's constitutional, which is always important in Australia. Successful, not always, but in improving the general tenor of debate. And there's a few case studies from South Australia that I think exemplify how these laws work in practice. They're interesting, particularly because you can see the parallels with federal advertising campaigns. So the courts have considered the idea that if you say that preferences for one candidate gives you another candidate, when we know that people choose their own preferences, that can be misleading. On the other hand, they've considered cases where an MP's been labelled as weak on crime because the MP supported due process for criminals. And the courts found there that that's a matter of opinion. They specifically said it's personal, negative and inflammatory opinion, but it's opinion nonetheless. So there you can see the courts drawing the line between opinion and fact. And it's a reminder for us that these laws aren't going to address all the advertising that we have problems with, but only the subset where our objection is that it's untruthful. You see talk about how a party's policies are going to save you a certain amount of money off your electricity bills, when in fact the modelling shows that that's not the case. That gets pulled up as misleading advertising, as does the claim that your opposition, your opponents have a secret plan to do so and so, when no evidence of such a secret plan exists. And finally, campaigns that pass themselves off as coming from an independent body, like an electoral commission, don't meet South Australia's, do meet the test of misleading advertising and have to be withdrawn. So we see...
So that was, in particular, that was when in the last federal election, there were signs in the same colour as the Australian Electoral Commission, but written in Chinese characters. And so that, was that ruled by the courts to be misleading?
From memory, they did end up finding that had breached Australian electoral law. So we do have at the federal level a limited provision that you can't mislead people about the kind of process of casting your vote. And I think they ended up falling afoul of that provision,
right?
Which is also kind of coming into play with some claims about preferences or which party backs which other party in the current election as well.
Right. Okay. Okay. So a lot has been, so that's a really good overview of what exists at the moment. It's small steps, one state, one territory that currently have the laws. What's your best guess as to whether in the next, say, 2 to 5 years, those laws will expand to other states? And is it always a state matter, or is it state or federal?
Yeah, it'll always be addressed at the state level for state elections and the federal level for federal elections. So people sometimes ask if the federal government could require all state and territory elections to be free from misleading advertising, and they can't. It has to be a jurisdiction by jurisdiction thing. But it's definitely possible for them to get legislated at either level or both. I think it's promising signs in Victoria to have the government and the opposition behind the laws. That happened in the ACT as well, where we got tripartisan support. So the Greens, in fact, proposed the bills in the ACT. All three, Liberal, Labor and the Greens, supported the bills. They passed unanimously. So for Victoria to have the two major parties lining up behind the laws, I hope means we'll have the laws and maybe even in time for the state election later this year.
Right. Well, let's hope so. Bill, thank you for that overview. That's been really helpful. I mean, it's something that almost intuitively you think, how do they get away with this? And the answer to that question is because they can, except in South Australia and the ACT. So hopefully we can put some sort of regulation. The other side of it, of course, is the people who are the almost free speech absolutists who think that free speech is the foundation of democracy, and any sort of regulation that tries to corral free speech is antithetical to democracy. What would you argue in response to that sort of argument?
Yeah, I think the strongest argument is that there's no right to mislead people. We have protections for a limited class of free speech in Australia through the Constitution, the implied freedom of political communication. And the court's been pretty clear that that doesn't extend to deceiving people. I can see the argument of the free speech advocates, people who think there should be no limitation. But of course, we've discussed already that there are many limitations on speech in Australia to protect people against hate speech, defamation, to prevent perjury, and to prevent misleading people in the course of trade and commerce.
Yep.
So these fall within that class. And as long as the protections for opinion are strong, I don't think we need to worry about that it goes too far.
Well, except the people who are the free speech absolutists would still maintain that any restriction on free speech is antithetical, but that's their argument. Let's just go to a number of the questions that came in when people registered. So there was one from Kay Farrow, and she said this. We sort of touched on this before, but you might want to go through it again. Campaigns, she says, campaigns of 5 to 6 weeks, and any deception or misinformation, timing to report, investigate, and remove it or refute it is short. Perhaps all advertising needs to be pre-approved before airing. What do you think about? Would that be workable if at least printed or yes, things that are either printed in hard copy or in soft copy, that they have to be pre-approved? Would that work?
I think it would be very difficult. It would certainly mean a big change to how campaigns are run, and potentially be too burdensome. In particular, I guess, if you consider 151 House of Representatives seats, multiple campaigns in each seat, plus the Senate races, plus the material that's designed for audiences outside of a kind of neat electorate. The idea of storing and publicly archiving advertising material is, I think, a kind of lesser example of that, because it would mean that the material could be checked by journalists, by opposing parties, by members of the public, to see exactly what claims parties have been making and candidates have been making. And it would also allow you to compare and contrast if there's different messages going to one group of the population compared to another. But that wouldn't require a kind of decision to be made about each piece of material as it's produced. So I think that would be more workable, and then trying to catch problems as quickly as possible, misleading advertising as quickly as possible after it's produced, strikes me as a more efficient way of going about it.
Okay, all right. Here's another question from Jeff Williams, and it's something that comes to my mind as well. Jeff says, what can be done to stop the shameless stunts by Clive Palmer to guarantee maximum home loan rates of 3% when it's the Independent Reserve Bank which determines interest rates? Just one example. So, I mean, it seems to me that just because Clive Palmer's ads are so ubiquitous and so in your face, that they're the ones that I think gets people's backs up a lot. Is there anything, even under the South Australian legislation, that can be done about those ads?
Yeah, I think the beauty of having the laws is that there's an independent umpire who gets to make those calls and would be able to request the kind of background information, any supporting evidence that they might have, and properly test those claims. It really kind of goes to a question of, is this policy or is it a kind of a promise? What's the kind of exactly what are the rules governing the Reserve Bank? So yeah, I really don't know in this case, but I think at the very least you'd be able to have a proper investigation and get an independent conclusion.
So do we know whether anybody in South Australia has tried to take Clive Palmer's ads to their courts?
The South Australian laws only apply to South Australian
elections
material.
So not federal.
No, yeah. So too limited to test this case.
Shame. Otherwise we could try it. Okay, here's another one from Carmel Boyce. She says, I'd love to see pollies setting KPIs for their parties. They set the KPIs that they think they can achieve and explain why if they don't reach them. I'm sick of the constant argy-bargy that we get now, where no one seems to be responsible for anything. It's almost like a comment rather than a question, but in the context of truth in advertising, if politicians make promises, let's say a KPI, what Carmel's talking about as a KPI is a promise to do something. How do you see laws about truth in political advertising applying in that sort of situation?
I think for the most part, the punishment for breaking a promise has to come at the next election, with voters weighing up a party's track record, deciding the circumstances around which the promise was broken, and making a decision then. I think you do see very limited cases in South Australia. One I can think of where it was a question around if someone had promised to back a political party or not. So this is an independent candidate, whether they'd promised to back a particular political party into government. And because it came immediately after the election, it had been kind of, it was a question of the electoral material. It did end up challenged in court. But overall, if you think about the different things that a party or a government has to weigh up in government, as well as the different ways of testing if a promise has been fulfilled, you know, often a site that tracks political party promises has to end up giving them half marks for certain things because of an imperfect implementation of a policy. I don't think it is the kind of thing that you can leave to an independent agency to decide.
And surely it depends on what the promise is, because a party could promise that they would do something, but circumstances change, and making the achievement of that promise really problematic in a way that was not foreseen. So that's different from making a promise that they would introduce a certain new program or fund a certain new program. Those sorts of promises surely can be held to account much more easily than saying, we promise to bring the unemployment rate from 5% to 3%. That could be an aspiration, or a policy standard, but you can't be held to account for achieving that promise because it depends on so many other contextual factors.
I think that's right. The only caveat to that is that it would be nice if politicians were more honest about the limitations that that do exist on them, so that hearing more about the effect that the international economy, the Australian economy, the environment, weather patterns, plague, natural disasters have to kind of frustrate the ambitions of government would, I think, help people put into context what government actually can and can't do. But yes, I agree with you that kind of ultimately any promise to try and change economic growth, for example, comes with a big asterisk that there are many factors outside of the government's control.
Look, at this stage, I'd like to open up the conversation to anybody else to ask a question. If somebody does have a question, can you just, Shale?
Yeah, hi, Meredith and Bill.
Hi, Shale.
I was just wondering, I mean, I think that, well, I get the impression that a large part of the line that goes on, especially around campaigns, can probably be attributed to a failure by the media to be able to, check the things that are being said and the truth of information that's being bandied about. What if there was an independent body, some authoritative body that had regular commentary apart from the media, where they could make weekly announcements, for example, to say what Clive Palmer is saying is absolutely false. He has no control over interest rates and things like that, as a way to provide factual information to the public, and to point out things that may have been said that aren't weren't true.
Yeah, there's actually been a proposal for something like that in Victoria, coming out of the same process that proposed truth in political advertising laws there. That recommendation's been accepted in principle by the government, but it hasn't attracted the same kind of attention that truth in political advertising has. So I don't know kind of what the chances of it being implemented are. I think in general, it'd be good to see more fact checking, whether that's done by the ABC, other media organisations, or by a dedicated agency.
Yeah.
So what about if the legislation that governs the Australian Electoral Commission or their various state counterparts, what about if that legislation were expanded to give them the authority to monitor truth in political campaigns, at least, maybe not all the time, but during the official political campaigns? Would that be possible?
I think it would be possible. You'd want to discuss whether it was the Electoral Commission that you wanted to do that work or a separate independent body. So for truth in political advertising, although the Electoral Commission is the default, it's been adopted in those places that have used the South Australian model. There's also been proposals to set up a separate agency or perhaps a kind of body of former politicians who, on the basis that they know it when they see it, would have a bit of a kind of practical sense of what goes beyond the pale. So yeah, there's different bodies that you could have do it. Electoral commissions are one option, but yeah, definitely an option.
I'm sort of looking forwards to the future. Let's assume that there's a change in government on May the 21st or May the 22nd. Do you know whether the opposition currently has a policy about this issue?
Yeah, so it appears in the Labor Party's national policy platform. There's a lot in there that they'll have to, if they're elected, decide how to prioritise. But it does exist as Labor policy, and similarly, Senator Christina Keneally has supported it. So it's kind of promising signs there, but it hasn't, to my knowledge, been mentioned in the election campaign, for example. So it's not come up as a seeming priority for them.
And what about the Liberal Party? I mean, clearly they haven't done anything about it yet, but do they have it as part of their policy platform?
It doesn't appear in Liberal Party policy. And there was a question from one of the independent MPs for the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, at some point during the term of this Parliament, where from memory, he ruled it out. But in any case, he kind of had a chance to support it and didn't support it. So that's not to say that things won't change. In New South Wales, for example, although they don't have these laws, they were proposed by a former leader of the National Party. So it's certainly not divided on left-right grounds, but at the moment at the federal level, no.
And yeah, interesting that the Liberal Party, I think, is undergoing a bit of a transformation internally anyway. So these sorts of issues about integrity may gain more traction within the Liberal Party in the future. Rosemary, did you have a comment? I note that you've brought your video on board.
Sorry, I just finished dinner.
That's all right. That's all right.
I've been listening, but I find it very interesting. I'd like to see the laws brought in, because there is so much. I think there's too much slanging in the political debate, but I don't know if you can stop that.
No, I think truth in political advertising, whatever law is there, and the South Australian one has been there for a while, but I doubt whether that's really going to change the tone of the debate. It's more to do with whether people deliberately or even unintentionally lie in a way that can materially mislead the public. But the civility of discourse within political campaigns, I don't know how you do something about that. It just seems to be getting worse and worse, unfortunately.
The debate the other night was...
Yes, unfortunately I was out of the country, so I didn't see it. I read about it though.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that maybe the focus needs to be a little bit earlier in the piece, and not wait until the campaigns, where we could have a requirement for all politicians to be to undergo aptitude tests and psychological assessments to make sure that they're suitable for the job. Before they're allowed anywhere near it. That would perhaps help them, stay civil in debates and other interactions.
My brother would agree with you, Shale. He thinks they should be tested for whether they're all sociopaths or psychopaths.
Yeah. Well, when you think of all the important professions that we have in society and how they need to be qualified to do their jobs, I think that politics should definitely be seen in a similar light. The roles that they have are extremely responsible ones that impact all our lives, and I think there should be some kind of qualification that they, at least a minimum standard they need.
Yes. Look, there's a number of things that you could say about that, but it's sort of probably going down a different rabbit hole, and maybe we can have a webinar about qualifications for politicians in the future. Socrates and Plato might have something to say about it as well. Okay, if there's no more comments or questions, I think we might start to wrap this up. Bill, Are you optimistic or pessimistic for the future?
I think I'm by temperament an optimist. So yeah, I'm optimistic. I think, you know, while there are always going to be threats to democracy here and around the world, the power of the idea is so great that in general, and particularly as time passes, it's going to, you know, spread and remain entrenched where it currently exists. It will require constant vigilance from the public, the media, from civil society to maintain it. But it's, I think once it exists, it's relatively hard to put it back in the bottle again. So I'm optimistic about kind of these issues improving in general, but there's a lot of kind of local areas where things could get worse, unfortunately.
Yeah, I must say, we all know that there are swings in political sentiment across countries, and people who, like me, became very politically active in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, we thought that the general direction was towards more progressive policies, and then there's been this shift back more towards the more conservative policies. But to what extent do you maybe agree with me that seeing the way that the moderate liberals have really started to coalesce and stand their ground against the neocons within the coalition, that's a really positive sign? And indeed, the whole independence movement, that is, candidates who are not a member of an existing political party, but standing up and really going back to grassroots and saying, well, what is this political candidate supposed to do? And that is to represent a particular electorate and take to Parliament the general views of that political electorate. It seems to me that could be seen as a bit of a swing back from the extreme conservative movement or edge of the line, a bit more back towards the centre. How do you feel about that?
I think it's been really reassuring to see the rise of voices for movements around the country, kind of community organising, people getting together and debating policy, considering candidates and so on. There's been a real fall in political party membership in Australia, as there has been around a lot of the world. And a lot of that work is really important, the kind of grassroots membership, policy creating, choosing candidates, lining up behind different policies and so on. So I think what I'd really like to see is parties growing as well as independent movements growing, because I think they're actually at their heart, both of those would be signs of a greater democratic engagement in general. Sometimes party-led, sometimes independent-led, but in all cases kind of led by the public more generally. I think, yeah, you do see sometimes people seeking change from within the party structure and sometimes outside of it. And it's interesting to see the success of those movements politically. You know, you could go back to the Democrats, for example, as well as, you know, there's been from time to time independence in all our parliaments and since federation. So it's a part of a strong tradition, but I hope that it actually contributes to a revitalizing of parties as well as independent movements.
Well, we will find out on the 21st or the 22nd of May whether the voices of movement, the independence movements, are going to, like the Australian Democrats' slogan, keep the bastards honest. Let's hope that they do. Well, they've obviously had some sort of impact already. Let's hope that that is institutionalized so that we get a better or an improvement in our democracy in the future. Bill, thank you so much for your time. Really, really interesting, and all power to your arm and the Australia Institute. And thank you for all the work that you're doing in this area. And we look forward to working with you in the future, because it's something that the Rationalist Society is really keen to ensure as well, because to us, truth generally is really, really important. And in an era where emotionality is often seen as the truth over rationality, the more we can do to promote the idea of truthfulness, if not truth, but truthfulness, all the better for our democracy. Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you, Bill.
And our next webinar will be after the results of the election, so on the 4th Wednesday of June. And we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible at that time. So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.